Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've already talked about mitosis and meiosis, how cells divide. We've talked about through meiosis is used for reproduction, and that you end up getting sex cells or gametes or haploid cells, and they each have half the DNA, 23 chromosomes. We've talked about the fact that the chromosomes during that process end up basically crossing over, and therefore you get mixed up DNA to give you genetic variation. We've talked about what DNA is. We've talked about the fact that it has chromosomes, that the chromosomes are inside the nucleus of the cell, that they basically run the cell and tell the cell what to do. We talked about that on those chromosomes there are alleles or genes, and that those genes actually control different traits. There's a gene for hair color, eye color, that type of thing. We've talked about the fact that an allele is one of the variations of that trait on that gene. So you can have a blue-eyed allele or a brown-eyed allele. And now we're going to finish off heredity by kind of talking about some different traits, and we're going to talk about Punnett squares. So first of all, the definition of heredity. What is heredity? Heredity is the passing of traits from parents down to offspring. So when we talk about passing genetic information from the parents down to the offspring, we're talking about heredity. What is genetics? Genetics is the study of how those traits get passed down through the interactions of genes. What is a gene? Again, a gene is a material that controls a trait. And then genes come in pairs. You get one gene from your father and one gene from your mother for each trait. So for instance, for hair color, you get a hair color gene from your mother and a hair color gene from your father. Eye color, you get a hair color gene from your mother and an eye color gene from eye color, you get an eye color gene from your mother and an eye color gene from your father. So basically they are passed down. And when they're passed down, we call them alleles. For instance, if you get a brown-eyed color from your mom and a blue-eyed color from your dad, we call those alleles. So what is an allele? Again, it's a different form of a trait. So again, if my trait or my gene is for hair color, you might say one allele would be brown, the other allele would be blonde. Okay? If my gene being passed down was eye color, you might say one allele is to have brown eyes and one allele is to have blue eyes. It's a form of a gene. Now, genes can be dominant or recessive. If a gene is recessive, what that means is that it will be covered over and you won't be able to see it if there's a dominant gene being passed down with it. Okay? So if you get a dominant gene passed down and a recessive gene passed down, the recessive gene will still be there in the organism, but you won't be able to see it. It will be hidden or covered over by the dominant gene. Okay? Recessive alleles or recessive traits will only show up if you have two recessive genes passed down to the offspring. One recessive from the mother and one recessive from the father. So there's no dominant alleles present. Okay? Recessive alleles are basically represented by lowercase letters when we talk about them. A dominant allele or dominant gene is basically a gene that takes over when it is passed down. So if you get even just one of them passed down to an offspring from a parent, that will be the trait that actually, or the form of the trait that actually shows up. And dominant are represented by capital letters. Now, when we're talking in genetics, we talk homozygous and heterozygous. The prefix homo means the same, and zygous stands for like zygote, which means two of the genes have been passed down and come together. Okay? If something is homozygous, it means both of the alleles for that particular trait, or both of the genes for that particular trait, are exactly the same. Okay? It means the gene that your mother has passed down is the same as the gene your father has passed down. Okay? Or the allele that your mother has passed down is exactly the same as the allele that your father has passed down. Now, if your mother and father both pass down a dominant allele, for instance, hair color, brown is dominant, blonde is recessive. So if both of your parents pass you a brown-haired allele, a dominant allele, then we would say that you are homozygous dominant for brown hair. If both of your parents pass you down the recessive allele, the blonde-haired gene or allele, and you have two of them, then we would say you're homozygous recessive for blonde hair. Now, if your mother passes you down a dominant gene, and your father passes you down a recessive one, or vice versa, your mother passes you down a recessive gene, and your father passes you down a dominant gene, then we would say you're heterozygous. The prefix hetero means different, and zygous again means zygote, so different genes in the zygote. Okay? And heterozygous, everybody, no matter who you are, if you're heterozygous dominant, because your mother may have passed you down a dominant gene, and your father passed you down a recessive gene, and so the thing that's going to show up is the dominant gene, so we would call you heterozygous dominant. Two more things here. Genotype. A genotype, when we talk about genotype, it's basically your genetic makeup. So that's your genetic makeup. It's the genes that you have. The way I remember this one is geno stands for genes, and so it's the genes that you have. Phenotype is your physical characteristics. It's what you see on the outside when you look at someone. So the way I remember this one is pH is the beginning of physical, and pH is the beginning of phenotype. So this is actually your physical appearance, what people actually see. What's a Punnett Square? Well, a Punnett Square is a tool that we use to figure out if a mother and a father have offspring, what will their chances of their offspring be of having certain genes or certain things passed down to them, alleles passed down to them. In a Punnett Square, the letters stand for dominant and recessive alleles. Again, the uppercase letters are dominant. The lowercase letters are recessive. So let me give you an example right here. And guys, this one down here should have a little r, so it should be big R, little r. But this is an example of a Punnett Square. Let's say that these are flowers. Okay? And in flowers, having a red flower is dominant, and having a white flower would be recessive. The capital R would stand for the red. The little r would stand for the white. In this case, your mother goes across the top. So your mother's genes go across the top. Your father's genes go up and down on the side. So in this case, we would have a mother with a genotype of capital R, little r, and her phenotype would be that she has red flowers. Over here we have a father who has a genotype of capital R, little r, and again the phenotype would be that he has red flowers. Then we're going to use this square to cross them. So we're going to bring the capital R down and the capital R over. You have capital R, capital R. Bring the capital R over and the little r down. Capital R, little r. Bring the capital R down. And guys, this one should be a little r, so bring the little r over. Capital R, little r. And finally, bring down the little r and over the little r. You got little r, little r. So what this means is if these two flowers that are both red and have these genotypes had offspring or children, they would have a 75% chance of having a red flower because 3/4 of the boxes have a capital R in them. They would have a 25% chance of having a white flower because, again, the two little r's down here are recessive, and that's the white trait, so it's white flower. They would have actually a 25% chance of having a homozygous dominant flower for a child. Homozygous because these two are the same. Dominant because they're both dominant genes. They would have again, remember this is supposed to be a little r, they would have a 50% chance of having a heterozygous dominant child. Heterozygous because the genes or the alleles are different. And dominant because one's a capital R, one's a little r. And finally, they would have a 25% chance of having a homozygous recessive child. Homozygous because the genes are the same. Recessive because they're both little letters, they're both little r's. So when we're talking about Punnett squares, that's kind of what we're talking about. Let's do a sample problem. In roses, red flowers are dominant, white flowers are recessive. What are the possible offspring that a homozygous red rose is crossed with a homozygous white rose? What would their offspring have? Well, homozygous, homo tells us that we're going to have the same genes, okay? And they're red, which means they're dominant, so that would be 2 capital R's. So this parent's going to have 2 capital R's. And in the next slide, guys, we make the white roses actually W's. So here, this is homozygous white rose, so we're going to have the same genes, and they're going to be white, so we're going to have two little W's. So again, if you look up here, here's the flower with the two capital R's. Here's the flower with the two little r's. This is the homozygous dominant red rose. This is the homozygous recessive white rose. And when you bring the R down and W over, R down, W over, R down, W over, R down, W over, this is what you get. For the phenotype, for what the children will actually look like, we have 100% chance of having red flowers. Every offspring from these two flowers are going to be red. Because again, you have capital R's and little W's, and the capital takes over, so you have 100% chance of having red flowers. For the genotypes, the genes, you have 100% chance of having a heterozygous dominant flower. Heterozygous because hetero means different and the genes are different. Dominant because you've got a capital R in there, so heterozygous dominant. Let's take now two of these children and have these children breed and create offspring. So here are the children, capital R, little w, capital R, little w. This one up here is a heterozygous dominant flower. This one here is a heterozygous dominant flower. And we bring down the R's and we bring over the W's, and then we get basically these things in here. For our phenotypes, for what the children will look like, we have a 1, 2, 3/4 chance or 75% chance of having red flowers. We have a 25% chance of having white flowers. For our genotypes, up here we have two capital R's. This is the only box that has that. So we have a 25% chance of having a homozygous, because they're the same, dominant, because they're dominant, flower. If you look at these two here, we have a 50% chance of having a heterozygous, because they're different, dominant, because this one's dominant flower. And if you look at this one, we have a 25% chance of having a homozygous, because they're the same, recessive flower, because they're both recessive. So now let's pick two of these flowers and have them breed. I picked the homozygous dominant flower and the heterozygous dominant flower. And then you bring down the R's and over the R's and bring down the W's and over the W's, and here's what you got. In this case, our phenotypes are, again, we have a 100% chance of having a red flower. Every flower from these two parents has to be red. But here, if you notice, we have two of the boxes with capital R's in them. So we have a 50% chance of having a homozygous, because they're the same, dominant flower. And here we have a 50% chance of having a heterozygous, because the genes are different, dominant flower, because you have a dominant gene in there. So in summary, traits are controlled by the alleles on chromosomes. An alleles effect, it's either dominant or it's recessive. You get two alleles passed down to you, one from your mom and one from your dad. If one of them is dominant, then you're going to have the dominant trait. You're going to show up with the dominant thing. If they're both recessive, you're going to end up with the recessive trait. Dominant traits are represented when we do crosses with capital letters. Recessive traits are represented by lowercase letters. The genes for your traits are called genotypes, so that's actually the letters, the genes. And what you actually physically show, what people actually physically see, is called your phenotype.